Hey you guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we're talking about fishing with tubes. Everything from catching southern and western largemouth to catching giant northern smallmouth. Let's go. Tubes continue to be one of the most overlooked baits in the sport of bass fishing. With the popularity of drop shot and Ned rigging, the tube has just crashed, but the effectiveness has not. Tubes are incredible fish catchers, so much so that I have gone back to throwing a tube more than a Ned rig, personally. It's amazing how well they work. Now, tubes apply to basically every lake in the country, from giant flipping tubes to little tiny finesse tubes. There's a tube for every situation. What I want to do today is really simplify it for you. That's first. Second, I want to show you some very specific hooks and heads that we use to get specific actions out of the baits. And then third, I want to convey to you what we do with the tube that is so different, because it's something that you can do to catch way more fish, to catch giant fish, and people just don't do it. So to kick things off, let's start with that more traditional tube. Well, I say that, it's all traditional. We're gonna start with southern fishing, okay? So like big largemouth in the south. Then let's talk reservoir fishing, and then let's talk about northern smallmouth, largemouth, all that stuff, but that northern style of tube fishing, and we'll wrap up there. Talking about the southern thing, that is the one place where tubes are completely overlooked, and I keep it crazy simple. I use one tube. Big bite baits, 4-inch tour flipper, okay? Nobody, I say that, there are a few people, but almost nobody flips with a tube. Guys flip creature baits, guys flip craws, guys will throw jigs in heavy cover, but almost everyone overlooks the tube. A tube is deadly as a flipping bait. It comes through the stuff differently than the other baits. It's got a different look on the bottom, but it's a large profile, and they eat it. Rig it on a 4/0 or a 5/0 flipping hook and go. If you want to show your fish something different this year, are you in Florida? Are you in the South? You're flipping heavy cover. Everybody's flipping the same creature baits. Try flipping with a tube. That's how simple we're going to leave that. Okay, we're just going to check that box. If you're in that situation, try a tube. And in the video description, I'm going to link you all these baits in the order that we talk about them. I'm going to include my favorite colors for everyone. Like this one in particular is a color I smashed with. Had some big bites in Florida on that one. But I'm leaving that simple, because that's just a little tiny segment of tube fishing. The farther into this rabbit hole we go together as we work across these baits, we're gonna get more and more in depth. Now, reservoir guys, I say reservoirs, really, reservoirs, natural lakes, traditional tube fishing. This bait right here, in that color, that's how I grew up. My dad and brother threw this 95% of the time. If we weren't throwing this, we were throwing a morning dawn magic worm. And when you could get the one with the little chartreuse tail, not just the whole pink worm, that was like next level for us. We caught so many fish on this stuff growing up. It was incredible. We'd go out 3 guys on the boat, all throwing the same bait, all catching fish. I mean, I have thrown a tube as far back as I can remember. They work. They just plain catch fish. This tube right here, I mean, thousands and thousands of hours I've spent throwing that gets it. That's one of the great baits. Now, there are, of course, some others. Dry Creek in more recent years. The Dry Creek tournament tube, one of my all-time favorite tubes. Tim turned me on to that one. Tournament style tube. So there's some differences in tubes. We'll get to the little tubes at the end. That's the really cool stuff. But in the meantime, you've got what we call a tournament style tube, which is a long, skinny tube. It's single dipped. I mean, they literally make a tube by dipping it in plastic. So that's a single tube, or a single dip. And then you've got more of your double dip style tube. They're fatter, they're thicker, okay? Whether that be a 3.5 or a full-blown flipping tube, those are double dipped tubes. That's how they get the different profile. When I'm in clear water reservoirs, we're talking largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, right? I'm thinking Orville, Shasta, New Maloney's in the west, and 1,000 other places across the country. A tournament style tube is deadly. When I say a tube, for me, is getting thrown more than a Ned rig, this isn't the style of tube that I rely on heavily across the core of the country. When you're just trying to get a bite, when you need to catch fish, you take a tournament style tube and a standard tube head, like a 60-degree tube head, 1/4 ounce, by the way. If you just need one, it's 1/4 ounce. That traditional style tube with just a regular 3/16 or 1/4 ounce head in it is just so deadly. It's crazy. Now you can throw that thing, when you throw these into the water, they do what we call a death spiral on the way down with this style of head. And that is incredibly effective in certain situations. It's amazing in clear water when you throw these out and they start that swirl to the bottom, how those fish will just come to that. And it just works. And then once they're on the bottom, I keep it so simple. I mean, I basically just pull these baits, maybe shake it a little as you pull, but just pull them, let them sit. Pull them, let them sit. Pull them. That's all I do with them. On steeper banks, say it's a steep reservoir, you just throw it up there shallow and then you just sort of pull it out and let it fall again. Pull it out and let it fall again. That's it. Tournament style tubes are easy to fish with, and they catch a lot of fish. I mean, this style tube, you go to a clear water reservoir, when those fish back out in the summer and they're in 20, 30, 40, 50 feet of water, you can drop these tubes down on them and you just sort of bounce them along, and those fish just, they smash them. It just works. Again, that's very traditional fishing. Now, one thing I will say is when I'm targeting largemouth primarily, my main tube color, and you can just take this to the bank, is green pumpkin. Green pumpkin black flake, green pumpkin blue flake. I'll even branch out to like a dark melon. But green pumpkin base is my #1, and then more of that brown base is my #2. Super simple, right? When I flip, green pumpkin or green pumpkin black blue, that's what we're talking. Very, very basic color schemes. Now, when we start talking about going north, then my colors really change up. And again, we're about to get to that. But let's talk about more of those core tubes, if you will. I would say the main tube that I'll fish with today is either a tournament style tube in clear water or a double dip tube everywhere else. And I'll throw them in clear water too if the fish will eat them. If I'm just getting short strikes or I'm not getting bit, I'll go to a tournament tube. But if they'll eat them, I stay with those double dipped profiles because it's actually a pretty large bait. And in addition to catching tons of fish, you can catch big fish. So in the traditional tube category, I've got 3 of them for you. It's a big bite. That guy is just a fish smasher. Tons of salt. Like as I roll this, the salt just starts pouring out of that tube. It's just coming out in my hand. Loaded up with salt. Incredibly soft. It's a very, very good bait. The second one, STH. This is the STH Tube through net bait. Also loaded with salt, but the salt is a little more encapsulated in the tube. But again, crazy soft. The biggest difference between these two is that the STH has longer tails than the Big Bite. The Big Bite, you got one size, you're gonna take it out, you're gonna pop a head in it, you're gonna go. The STH, if that's the profile you want, where you got those long tails on there, you leave it. But you can also trim them up a little bit. Just grab your scissors, clip them a little, shorten it up, and create that same profile. So you just chop them. So this tube with those long tails gives you some more options. And then the other one is the Savage Gear Goby tube. Now, I don't know if you can see it or not, but that tube has full fins. It's got a little goby face on them, fin on top. That tube is, again, it's a double dipped style or shape, although it's actually a single pour, but they're actually pouring a shaped mold with fins in it and everything. And this is something I use in the north. So this style of tube, you can throw with a standard head. So like a standard 60 degree, just like the tournament tube. I can take this and pop this into one of these tubes. Boom, you're in business, okay? But you can also switch over to a Goby style head or a fat head. The Goby style tube head is gonna be thick. See how it comes up to like a bulbous head? What that does when you stick that in your tube is it causes the head of that tube to be fatter. So the tube is thicker at the head than it is in the tail. Now that is because when you're in the north and you're imitating gobies, they literally have a big fat flat head on them. So that's what you're trying to imitate. But there's a lot of other advantages to that style of head. They come in heavier sizes, 3/8, half, 3/4. I would say my standard in a goby head is a half. Okay, so now you're talking about a tube that can be thrown aggressively in deep water, because now you can work it and pop it, right? In a 1/4 ounce, in a traditional, there's only so much I can do with that. That's why I typically let them go to bottom and I pull them. Now, one huge difference is that a traditional head rigged properly will typically do the death spiral going down. A goby style head with a fat head will typically fall in a straight line. Completely different. There are times for both, okay? There's a time where you want a death spiral. Clear water, fish can see that thing going down, they come to it like a rocket. I don't know what it is about it that attracts them. But if you're trying to reach fish, whether you're looking at live imaging or a sight fish, or you just know where your fish are, you know you're pulling up to a wreck in 20 feet of water and you know where they're gonna be. You don't want a bait that's gonna spiral, because if it's got a 6-foot spiral on its way down, you never know where it's gonna land. That goby style head will just sink like a bullet right to where you want it to be. So again, there's a time and a place for each style of head. And then again, that traditional head, 3/16 or 1/4, I'm not doing a whole lot with that head. I'm just sort of pulling it on the bottom, letting it sit. That goby style head, you can snap it or crack it. They call it cracking a tube, which is a whole different animal that we're just gonna briefly touch on, which is basically popping it, doing a big double pop off the bottom and then reeling up your slack. It's a lot like stroking a jig, but you're doing it with a tube. Just a little bit more narrow, downsized of a profile than doing it with a jig. It will catch them in the north, it will catch them in southern reservoirs too. You can crack a tube and catch some big ones, and you're gonna wanna do that with a goby style head. Again, you're showing these fish stuff that they don't see at this point. You start throwing tubes, any tube. You take a traditional tournament tube to your local reservoir, you're probably the only guy doing it these days. But you start talking about cracking tubes in open water in the south, you are definitely the only guy doing it. Now, these same tubes I take north. My colors just change a little bit. Again, largemouth fishing, green pumpkins, melons. When I go north, I'll still use melons. Melon, a dark melon, is a major player in the north. But the biggest deal for me, it's become huge the last few years, is throwing those sand colored tubes, those lighter colored, I call them goby colors, but sandy colored tubes, right? Sand colored, sand colored, sand colored. There's something to it. Let's just leave it right there. There is something to it. Make sure you play with it. I mean, if you're headed to the Great Lakes and you're not throwing a sandy colored tube, I don't know what you're doing. Now, that brings us to the last little segment here, and that is the tiny tubes. 2.5 or 2 3/4 inch tubes. They're so overlooked. We have shined a spotlight on them the last couple of years, so there's more people throwing them now than before, but even so, they are so overlooked. Most people throw a 3.5 to a 4 inch tube, right? A standard tube. So this is the STH. That's the 4 inch. This is the STH, same exact tube, but in the 2.5. See the difference there? Crazy difference. The 2.5, I catch bigger fish on the 2.5 than I do the 4 when I'm in clear water on the Great Lakes. It's amazing how effective that is. So that's the STH in the 2.5. The other one is the X Zone in the 2.75. Now, 2 heads for you. The first one, this is the Freedom Tackle, the 2/0. That's the part that matters. 2/0 hook. That fits really well in that 2 3/4 tube. You can also put it in the 2.5. I'm gonna struggle to get this into this tube because I didn't lube it up. I need some scent to lube it up. Then they just slide right in. But here we go. Come on, come on. Almost there. And again, all of the heads you'll notice that I'm using, except when I'm flipping in the south, all of them are exposed hooks. There's other rigs. Guys like to do the stupid tube rig. There's different that you could Texas rig them, but I really prefer an exposed hook. And see, that Freedom is like a little tiny goby head. But again, that's a 2 3/4 inch tube with the 2/0 hook in it. And then this is the one that changed everything for me. That STH 2.5, and then this head. This head wasn't even made for a tube. This is Blade Runner's inhaler head. Specifically, the 1/8 ounce 1/0. It's the 1/0. Not the 2/0, not a 3/0. 1/0. That 1/0 is the perfect length. It's also heavy wire. I can swing on a 5 or 6 pound smallmouth. I have zero fear of ever bending out that hook. That was a game changer for me. That allowed me to specifically target bigger fish in clear water on the Great Lakes with no fear of losing them. And look how well that sits down in that little tube. This, I have more confidence in catching a giant smallmouth on that than on literally any other finesse technique there is. That is my confidence bait, and in that color. Although I do sometimes throw like dark melon purple, a couple of others, but if my first choice, if I'm just gonna go out there and gamble, it's that right there. That is so deadly. Small tubes, again, you can use them to specifically target fish, but a lot of times I'm just pulling them on bottom. Areas where I know fish should be history fishing, right? Places you've caught them in the past. Go back and pull a tube for those fish and they just gobble them up. But going back to the 4 inch tubes, there's a whole other thing that I do. I talk about it here and there. We've taught it to you before, but today I want to be really intentional about it. I want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about, and that is targeting smallmouth. clear water, and it doesn't have to be smallmouth. I say smallmouth because my favorite place to do it is when I go north, chase some big smallies, clear water, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 feet of viz. That's my favorite time to do it, but you could do the same thing with spotted bass and largemouth. What you do is you take these tubes with a traditional head, okay, that skinny head, and that tube's gonna do the death spiral. You can do this post-spawn. I also like to do it with the last wave of pre-spawners, those last big ones that come in, because they like to float and sun themselves under the surface out in deep water. You'll see them with your eyes. You actually see them floating out off the bank, out in the open water. And they might be floating over 10 feet of water. They might be floating over 30 feet of water. But I'll take a traditional tube, STH, Goby tube, the big bite, whatever. Put that head in there, pop it through. And what I do is I lead those fish. Ooh, we got a big gust of wind. Let's let this blow by. I'm going to take that tube and I'm going to lead the fish. And this is everything. This works for offshore suspended smallmouth and spotted bass. You can also do this in the shallows, in the spring. When you see those fish cruising up in the shallows, you lead them. We all know if you see a fish swimming in shallow water and you fire a bait in there on them because you're excited, they're gonna spook. They always do. You gotta lead them. You have to get ahead of them. So what I do, let's talk shallow water first, and then I'll relay that out to deep water. Say I'm right here and I see a fish up here behind me cruising along the shoreline. Depending on the clarity of the water, that determines how much I lead them by. So if I see a fish swim in this direction and the water's fairly murky, I want to land 5 to 8 feet ahead of that fish, assuming they're not moving very quickly. Fire up ahead of them so that my bait will fall and then they'll come up to the bait and they'll see it as they go to pass it. Typically, I want it to land on the bottom, and then as the fish arrives, I give it one movement to catch their attention, and then that's it. You let them come in and they'll track it from there. A lot of times they'll pop it without you ever moving it again, but if they just sit there staring, I give it one more bump to trigger a bite. The clearer the water, the more I will lead that fish by. So if that fish is coming along here and this water's crystal, I'm throwing 20 to 30 feet ahead of that fish, even in shallow water. That way I'm down and I'm settled, and as that fish is approaching, I can give it that one bump. And again, the murkier the water, I want them closer before I bump it. The clearer water, I do it from farther away because they're still going to see it and it's not too obnoxious, it won't spook them. Now take that same thing and apply it to open water. These big fish pre and post spawn will suspend out over open water. Same exact deal. I spot them with my eyes, and these days with live imaging, you can do it with that too. But long before that existed, we were doing this to hunt these giant fish in open water. We would physically look for them. We're wearing good glasses, wearing amber in the middle of the day in crystal clear water, just to light it up, just so we can see farther. You spot those fish, okay? Creep on them with the boat until you're in range. Go slow. You don't want to be running around on 10. You'll just spook them all. But you just creep along likely locations, ends of long tapering points, big main lake points where arms come together, you know, the end of an offshore reef, or along the color line of a hump out in open water. When you physically see a fish, you lead them. Again, the clearer the water, the farther you lead by. If it's really clear, 20, 30, 40 feet, because the closer you get, they just spook. When you lead them at a great distance, and we have so much footage of us doing this, you guys just don't necessarily realize what's happening. We'll spot a fish, and you'll make a 40-foot cast out ahead of that fish, way off to the left of them, let's say. That bait will hit the water. Now, I want that standard style head so that the death spiral begins. Because if it hits with a goby style head and then goes to the bottom like a bullet, they may or may not follow it. But if that fish is here and I land over here and I start a death spiral down to the bottom, it's falling slower, it's covering more ground, that fish just, you'll see them start moving and then they'll just go out of sight because they're following it down. They'll follow it down 10 feet, they'll follow it down 40 feet. It's amazing. They will go out of sight. You let that thing hit bottom, and then the same rules apply as the shallow water. You just wait, you give it one bump, and then you just wait. Dong! They clobber that thing. It's amazing. If they don't, just start slow fishing it like a traditional tube, just barely moving it. And a lot of times they'll grab it then. But it's remarkable. It is a very effective way to catch very big fish in clear water that are otherwise traditionally considered uncatchable. It's huge. The tube is so overlooked, it's not even funny. Now, the other thing about a tube is the gear that I use. I'm very specific about my gear. I have 3 rods here. Concept is the same with all of them. This is a Loomis 872. That's my main tube rod. G Loomis NRX Plus 872 is out of this world. I put a twin power on it. The twin power, the best way to describe a twin power, the reel is unbelievable. It feels like a Stella, a Shimano Stella, but it's about half the price of a Stella. If you want to experience ultra high-end power in a spinning reel without spending Stella price, you buy a twin power. They're amazing. I love the twin power in general, and I love it for tube fishing. Now again, I'm using a little bit stouter rod than I do with any other finesse technique. And that is because sometimes I'm throwing this. Sometimes I'm throwing this with a ½ ounce in it. And I need the option. And again, even the little guy, he's got a stout hook in him. So I can smash a 6-pound smallie with that rod, with that reel. I go braid to leader. And my leader is typically going to be 8-pound unless I'm going to the bigger tubes. And crystal clear water, I go lighter too. I'll go to like 6 or 7. But bigger heads, all that stuff, I can go all the way up to 10 or 12. And that one rod will do all of it effectively. Now, that is a very, very high-end combo. Another high-end combo that I've fallen in love with. Because again, you see all these tubes? When I go and seriously do this, I'll have a bunch of these rods lined up, ready to rock. This is a St. Croix. This guy, Legend Tournament, sorry, that's not Legend Tournament, that's Legend Elite. Legend Elite 7.6 medium is incredible. Because again, I'm making these bomber casts, right? Sending that tube, leading those fish, letting that thing fall down in deep water. The one thing that you may not have heard, you heard it, but you may not have connected it, is that I haven't taken up any line yet, right? I told you to lead those fish, let that thing go all the way to bottom, and then give it one bump. What you may not have processed is that when this works, every single giant fish you hook is at the full end of a cast. It's never close to the boat. So that's what these rods are about. These rods have more power. They're longer, 7.6 medium. You reel down and you smoke them way out there. And again, exact same setup. Twin power, same line, same everything. Now one more. This is not a budget combo by any means, but it is much more affordable than both of those combos. I'm always looking for more options for people. This is a Zodius 7.6 medium paired to a Vanford 2500. That is a solid combo that can do the same thing. The rod is marginally softer than those two, just marginally. It will still do all of it, but you're doing it full combo, like Again, like I said, a twin power is a Stella on a budget. It's like half the cost. This combo is probably, I mean, I'm doing quick math in my head, but probably half the cost again. So you can do it more affordably. Fishing giant smallies up north, high-end gear is the norm, but you don't have to do that. This, if I hook a 6-pound smallie on this, I'm confident I can get them. And this is much more traditional for, say, a guy in the South or the Midwest too, budget-wise. But a really, really good option. I wanted to give you an alternative that isn't just outrageously priced. So I've been fishing different rods trying to find one, and I really like that Zodius. Guys, this is a fun technique. It'll catch a pile of fish. It'll catch little ones. You can catch 1-pound spotted bass all day long dragging a tournament tube, but it will also catch absolute giants, and it's something that is overlooked by the vast majority of anglers. I hope this video helped you. If it did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.